Good morning. It's good to be here. My name is Bill Simpson, and it's my privilege to serve as the Pastoral Care Lead at St. Anthony Shawnee Hospital in Shawnee, Oklahoma. I'm honored to be here, humbled, and quite honestly, a little bit surprised. My daughters, though, would not be surprised. I'll tell you a bit about them. My wife and I have been blessed with 3 daughters, adult daughters now, and for good or for bad, their lot in life was to grow up as PKs, that's pastors' kids. As they were growing up, I served various churches as a full-time minister of music, pastor of worship and arts. The name changed depending on the location, the church, the decade, but that was their experience. Now I'm a proud dad, I'll be honest with you, and I like to think our girls are fairly bright. They get that from their mother. I've been a husband for over 30 years, so I quickly acknowledge that. But they pretty quickly came to the conclusion that regardless of my job title, what they told me my real job was simply to stand around and talk to people. That's what I did. So to see that I would be here this morning standing around talking would not surprise them in the least. I'm grateful that I still get to do that in my work at the hospital. But I've come to recognize that talking is rarely the most important thing I get to do. I like to think I'm a better listener than I am a talker. That's a work in progress, to be entirely honest, though. But listening is so important. You may remember the Old Testament story of Job. Job was incredibly successful, had a large, beautiful family. Everything was going right for Job until all of a sudden it wasn't. It came apart in a hurry. He lost almost his entire family, all his wealth, everything, even his own health. And some of his closest friends, 3 of his closest friends, traveled from afar to come and be with him. The Bible tells us to sympathize with him, to console him. But Job chapter 2, verse 13 tells us that once they got there, that for 7 days and 7 nights, their ministry to him consisted of simply sitting on the ground and mourning with him. They didn't even say a word to Job. And by the time their visit with him concluded, it was very apparent that that was the most effective thing they did, because once they started talking, things went south in a hurry, if you know the rest of that story. As a chaplain, I'm still awed that people allow me to walk with them, to accompany them through some of the most difficult, some of the most intimate moments in their lives. And I've come to realize that in those moments, often the most meaningful thing I can do is to simply be present. I can't fix things. And more often than not, I'm not there to say a whole lot, at least not at the moment. But being present and being quiet is something we're not very used to. We're not used to quiet. We're not comfortable with it. We generally find it rather awkward. To be quite honest, it's usually easier to open my mouth than it is to really share in someone else's pain. But I must not allow my discomfort with their pain to goad me into filling the silence with the clatter of my own voice. To offer the simple gift of presence, to truly listen rather than to speak, is the most meaningful gift I can bring. Let me say that again. To be truly present, to listen, is the most meaningful gift I can bring. I remember getting a page early one morning, about 2 o'clock. That's rarely a good thing. If the phone rings, the pager goes off at 2 a.m., something's not good. And sure enough, I was paged to labor and delivery. And I arrived to learn that a young mother, about halfway through her pregnancy, had just experienced the tragic heartbreak of a twin fetal demise. I visited with her on my arrival, but I didn't stay long because she was still recovering from the delivery, and she wasn't ready yet for the opportunity to hold her babies. So I stepped out of the room, and as I did, I found her nurse working at a computer terminal nearby, but just using one hand. She was holding those tiny lifeless twins in her other arm because she said, I just couldn't leave them by themselves. I offered to hold them, didn't think a whole lot about it. Knew she had work to do, so I sat there quietly, just holding those babies. And as I did, this tender, caring nurse slowly and finally told me that this was her first experience caring for a patient experienced a fetal demise since she'd been part of our team. In a very different situation, I was in the ER one afternoon with a nurse who was visibly upset, visibly distraught by the transfer of a behavioral health patient who had been very aggressive and even violent. She said he just didn't understand how much I cared. And I just stood there, and she continued to talk and suddenly burst into tears and shared how just 2 days before, one of her very best friends had been admitted to the hospital with very similar circumstances. To be sure, there are occasions when a few words are appropriate. I was with a man one day, the day after he'd attempted to take his own life. And he said something that caught my ear. He said, "It's a good thing I didn't have a gun." And so I asked him, I said, what do you mean by that? He said, "Well, I would have taken care of one of God's little problems." I couldn't let that go unchallenged, so I suggested to him that as a creation of the living, eternal God, I didn't see him as a God's little problem. I saw him as a person of worth and of value. It was about 3 or 4 weeks later, he came by my office one afternoon to thank me. Not so much for what I'd said, because I'm not even sure he remembered what I said, but he came by to thank me simply for caring enough to be there. You know, it's been said that 80% of success is just showing up. And none of these opportunities would have presented themselves had I not done that, simply shown up. I'm grateful that my role provides me those opportunities to be present, to show up, often with people going through some very difficult circumstances. And many of those situations, those circumstances, are encountered in pretty predictable places like the ER or ICU. But if I'm truly present with those around me, wherever I happen to be, it's amazing the opportunities that will present themselves. It was just last fall, I was standing in line at the airport one morning about 4:30 in the morning. I wasn't particularly excited about being there. People with me in line weren't particularly excited about being there. Clearly, the ticket agents behind the counter weren't particularly excited about being there. And as we slowly snaked our way back and forth toward that ticket counter, I'd made eye contact a couple of times, maybe even smiled once or twice with an older woman in line behind me. And as I stared off into space, waiting for the line to move again, I suddenly heard her voice, very clear, very matter of fact, say, "My son died an hour ago." "I'm sorry, what did you say?" She said, "My son died an hour ago. He was just 50. His children are 6 and 8. She was much calmer than I am at the moment. I knew that the steadiness in her voice had to be from the shock more than anything else. I wasn't paged to the airport like I am to a situation at the hospital. I wasn't there to do a job. In fact, until she said that, I was hardly there at all. I was just standing in line at the airport. But the truth is, we all have similar opportunities, whether with patients and their families, with coworkers, or standing in line at the airport. The key, and it's not always easy, it's rarely easy, but the key is to be more fully aware, to be fully present wherever we are with those around us. But that's the kicker, isn't it? To be fully present. My encounter with that woman was very brief. We were almost up to the counter at that point. I like to think I was able to provide a listening ear, a presence, an opportunity for her to begin, in a very small way anyhow, to process the enormity of her loss. But even as a chaplain in my work at the hospital and elsewhere, I don't deliver or dispense God's presence in my encounters with other people. And as people who know me will readily attest, I certainly am not God myself. But in some small way, through the simple act of being there, through the power of presence, I can reveal God's healing presence already there and already at work. And that's an opportunity that we all share. It's a call. It's a call that we all share. And what higher call is there than that? I invite you to join with me as together we continue to answer that call wherever we may find ourselves each and every day. Thank you very much.